I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. As a matter of fact, this is the penultimate episode of this season of Forgotten Oscar Films as we jump back into the Oscar race. So if you're an Oscar fan, this week we get this episode, then next week we get the final episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. Then I plan on doing sort of a fall film festival roundup and just giving my thoughts on some of the festivals and where we are in the Oscar race before we jump right into predictions, Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, all that fun stuff that you always like to see. But if you are still new to the series, maybe coming back to the channel, essentially for the past summer, I've been looking at a movie that is nominated for Best Picture that I think has been forgotten to time, one that just hasn't had the same cultural impact as some of the other nominees, and really trying to figure out why that movie was forgotten and what factors had led to that. This is the second season of Forgotten Oscar Films, so we started in the year 2010 and sort of been working our way back. We're going to end the year 1989, in which the 1988 year is the first season of Forgotten Oscar Films, so you can continue and watch that. So we've got sort of a huge kind of decade, you have a huge, almost 50-year history of Oscars in both seasons of Forgotten Oscar Films kind of combined. So we got a whole lot of sort of Oscar history that if you're interested in that sort of stuff, there's plenty of Oscar history that we talk about within those videos, so please feel free to check out them, and as well as trying to answer that question as to why the movie is forgotten. I also give my thoughts on the movie, as well as, like I said, a lot of the historical context. And speaking of which, this year was the 1990 Oscars, and some people think of it as the Dances with Wolves Oscars, but I think many people think of it as the Goodfellas Oscars, because Dances with Wolves is the movie we're covering today, and it's similar to a movie like King's Speech, you could say, or even something like Ordinary People, where Dances with Wolves is a fine movie on its own right, has its fans, I totally understand that, but then it's almost most well known for being the movie that beat out Goodfellas, which is, seen as one of the greatest movies of all time, one of the best mob movies, arguably Martin Scorsese's best movie he's ever made. So in a part, the historical context of this week is just that connection to Goodfellas. And once again, we're covering a Best Picture nominee, which I don't think is a coincidence. As a matter of fact, next week I'm going to be covering a 1989's Driving Miss Daisy, which is another Best Picture winner, excuse me. So I think it's telling that by the end of this season, where we started in the year 2010, or actually 2011, and worked our way backwards to, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we started in the year 2013 and now have worked our way backwards, that we've actually covered 5 Best Picture winners in this Forgotten Oscar Films season, whereas in the last season, where we covered films from 1988 back to, I think, like 56, there was only 2 Best Picture winners we covered in that series. I think mostly just in part because, as a matter of fact, Dances with Wolves is kind of a representation of the split, that there's a split at a certain point of time where the Academy likes certain Academy movies and likes movies that are not necessarily always as popular, and oftentimes don't reward the movies that are popular. In the 70s, we had movies like Rocky and The Godfather, movies that are still well beloved and pop culturally relevant today, but they also won Best Picture, whereas nowadays, Nomadland is far from being, the center of culture, for example. So that's in part why I wanted to talk about Dances with Wolves in this episode, because it has a lot of historical context, but the movie maybe isn't as well appreciated necessarily. But first, let's just jump into the other nominees, why I chose Dances with Wolves over something like Goodfellas, which was one of the nominees. Of course, that's a movie that is still very highly rated, still on TV all the time, really well beloved, from a really well beloved filmmaker. In my opinion, that probably should have won Best Picture this year, but nevertheless, Goodfellas, everyone's probably seen it at this point, so didn't want to pick that one. We also have Awakenings, which is a Penny Marshall film with Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, which I almost did, but I also think that just because Robert De Niro and Robin Williams are so sort of two titans of film, the fact that they were in a movie together, and the fact that it's so good, and actually I think holds up pretty well as a really sort of tragic but also charming movie as well. We also have Ghost, which was the sort of big box office sensation of the year, and I also thought about maybe covering Ghost just because it was very popular at its time and it's less popular now. That being said, even though I haven't even seen Ghost, I still know all of the sort of references of the the pottery scene, and there are some certain scenes that have sort of transcended pop culture that people may not have even seen Ghost like myself, but know some of the references. So just because of that, I think it sort of stood the test of time in that regard. And then you also have The Godfather Part 3, which was a sort of a comeback to, you know, the Godfather world, directed by Francis Ford Coppola in his sort of 90s resurgence period. And even though the reviews were still sort of mixed at the time, for a lot of people, it was something that, you know, the Godfather 1 and 2 both won Best Picture. How could you not at least nominate Godfather Part 3? However, over time, I think the movie has sort of a more negative reception, obviously because it's not Godfather 1 or 2. So because all the other movies had sort of one element, I wanted to go with Dances with Wolves because I think it's a testament to cover Best Picture winners on this series. Because if a Best Picture winner is covered on the series, then maybe, you know, the Oscars maybe have made a mistake, or it just, like I said, shows the divergence of Oscar taste versus sort of more general pop culture taste, which is why we almost got the introduction of the Best Picture winner, which I think is something that is away for right now, but could rear its ugly head up back once again. But like I said, The Dances with Wolves is also a really interesting historical movie in that sense. That one thing I think is really interesting is that it's the beginning of the movie star turned director prestige movie. That really before this, you know, we had Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, who were sort of in control of their careers, and Warren Beatty did, you know, his own directing in something like Reds, which is a movie we covered. But this really, I feel like, launched it, that this was a huge gamble that paid off, and Kevin Costner was a director, he was a star, he was a producer, he was the main force of the movie, and he sold the movie him, and that just gave so much more power to the star. So we get, you know, Dances with Wolves in 90, we get Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood in 1992, we get El Postino, which we covered in 1994, we get Braveheart in 1995. I mean, these movie stars turned directors. Oh, The Prince of Tides, 1991, we covered Barbra Streisand, another sort of movie star turned director, you know, putting themselves in the movie and it being a big hit and it getting Oscar nominations. And that was something that I think really started with Dances with Wolves and Kevin Costner's kind of huge gamble. But that being said, it was also a movie that reinvigorated the Western genre. That it's easy to look back on historical times and to think, oh yeah, the Western was always around. But there are certain early film genres that just don't exist anymore, like the screwball comedy kind of transformed into the romantic comedy, but it doesn't really exist in its purest essence. And the Western was one of those genres that could have been left if it weren't not for Dances with Wolves. I mean, the Western was a huge genre in the 50s and into the 60s, especially even going back to the 30s and early days of cinema with John Wayne, who is still the sort of most bankable box office movie star of all time. I mean, almost every one of his movies premiered at #1 at the box office, was a huge success. He was in, you know, 2-3 movies a year, and he was just such a huge star for like a good 30 years. John Wayne was the star, and many of his movies were westerns. So when the new Hollywood sort of came around in the late 60s and sort of that transitionary period where it was a little bit more realistic, a little bit more sort of socially charged, politically charged, a little bit more violent, those types of movies, we don't really see the Western again. You know, throughout the 70s and the 80s, we get a few couple movies, but very rare in that sense. We don't really think of those decades as Western decades. So, and in so many ways, they called this production actually Kevin's Gate, as reference to Heaven's Gate, which was a huge Western big budget that ultimately sort of killed the genre when it was released in 1980 and sort of symbolized the end of the new Hollywood, and there's a lot of historical sort of importance placed upon that movie. But then Dances with Wolves is so much more interesting as well because, you know, a decade later, where Westerns were still seen as sort of dead, Costner was able to sort of bring it back and make an expensive movie and make such a huge hit out of it. That's another thing, that this was really a huge hit at the time. So it's got this historical importance because it's the start of the 90s kind of movie star turned director. It's a revival of the Western, or the revisionist Western. And then I think that it's also, in many ways, actually a representation of the divergence of, like I said, the audience taste versus the Oscar taste. In the 70s, we get The Godfather and Rocky, but in the 90s, picking a movie like Dances with Wolves instead of something like Goodfellas, because you want the movie to feel a little bit more serious or epic or a little bit more important, where the truth is Goodfellas was probably the best movie of the year, and, you know, if you were to go back, people probably would have given it to Goodfellas. That being said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just sort of, I think, a real representation of where the Oscars are now and where they were before. I think this is kind of a good divergence point of the point of picking Dance with Wolves, a movie that's longer and serious and epic and a period piece, versus the more exciting, more entertaining kind of poppy Goodfellas. And that divergence, the picking of the Dance with Wolves, the Oscars have gone down sort of one path and haven't turned back since. So the movie has a lot of historical importance to it. But speaking of the movie itself, transitioning into my thoughts, I think this is one of the most beautifully composed movies of all time, with incredibly rousing performances. It's just a shame that it's really hard to pay attention to. This is a movie about John Dunbar, who is a Civil War lieutenant who travels to a fort and finds it abandoned. So while he's waiting for reinforcements, he starts to develop a relationship with the local Lakota native tribe and eventually starts to sort of become part of their ways and part of their culture. And the movie is gorgeous, really, from start to finish. And you gotta give a huge shout out to Dean Semler, the cinematographer, and his ability to just bring in sort of these large pools of light in these open spaces while still sort of giving it a naturalistic look. So it's got sort of a naturalistic, sort of grounded part, but very much a soft lighting applied over top of it. So it is sort of nostalgic and it's a little bit more romantic in that sense. But also I want to give some credit to Kevin Costner. He's got a lot of great framing and camera movements that clearly, he designed, where, simple things that we don't see too often, where he is moving the camera in certain instances, but he's also sort of keeping me locked down. For example, people will be crouching, so you're down low to the ground, and then they stand up. We stand up with them, and then somebody walks away, and there's still person in the frame, and then someone enters the frame. So it's, simple camera movements like that, not doing a lot, sort of keeping it in one shot, these sort of extended takes that, in a modern day movie, we would have cut to the person coming in and cut out, and just a little bit more editing, even though it wouldn't be necessarily necessary. This movie I appreciated for its framing and silhouettes, and you can tell that a lot of it was inspired by the 30s westerns of John Ford. And what makes the sort of images so much more rousing as well is, of course, the great performances by really everyone involved, but particularly, I think, John Barry's score. At every chance, there's sort of this great, rousing, epic, grandiose kind of score that's placed onto the movie that just, I think, affirms that sort of romanticism that John Dunbar, that Kevin Costner, and that ultimately the audience has for that Western frontier. It really is sort of a beautiful place, and we see it through John Dunbar's eyes, and we can see how beautiful it is, and that score really gives it sort of an epic, rousing kind of a quality to it, and rightly deserved of that Oscar. But if I'm being honest, there were parts of the movie that I had trouble sort of engaging with, just because, frankly, of the runtime. That this is frankly, for better or for worse, I've been conditioned that if a movie is 3+ hours, that it's going to be an epic story. That we're going to sit you down and we want to sort of take 3.5 hours of your time, and it better be sort of a long period of time, or a great journey, or some sort of large character narrative arc, which this movie does have. But I felt that, if this movie were maybe made today, it would have been cut down maybe about a half an hour. And I watched the theatrical version, the 3-hour version, rather than the 4-hour director's cut. Now, maybe the 4-hour director's cut sort of goes so far that I would enjoy it, but at the 3-hour point, it feels a little bit mixed, because sometimes, you want, like, these great battle scenes, which are really great and make sense. And like I said, we got these beautiful landscapes and this epic score. But then there's significant portions of the film where we see John Dunbar fall asleep and then wake up and then go ride for his horse and then, put up some wood. And it's just like 20-25 minutes of this. And you're thinking to yourself, like, I get that it's slow and we're supposed to understand that he's alone, but the sort of plot, the sort of conveniences of the story and how things move along, wasn't at a fast enough pace. Now, if the movie was just, seeing how a man lives, or survives, that would be one thing. But when the plot is clearly there of this sort of character arc that you want John Dunbar to take, the pace really, unfortunately, I think, takes its time getting to that point. So we get not enough of sort of living in that world, but too much of sort of seeing what he does. We understand what he does, but we still have to see it. So there's some odd choices in that sense. So, maybe that's one reason why the movie is more well respected and historically important, rather than actually well liked and appreciated. But now transitioning into that part, why this movie is forgotten. And in one sense, it's not forgotten. I know this has a lot of fans. You see it on TV every once in a while, but I do think out of those 5 nominees, it probably is the most forgotten. And I think it's even more telling that this is a movie that, won Best Picture and is still one of the most forgotten out of this bunch of lineup of the 1990 Oscars. And I think in one part, it's because these movie star turned directors, as we talked about last week with Barbra Streisand, is that if the movie star isn't as relevant anymore, their directing career sort of falls to the side. That, Ben Affleck is someone, that has made a lot of great movies. He made The Town and then Argo, but then he makes something like Live by Night, which isn't as well received. And then people kind of forget that, he's this really great director. So as Costner sort of transitioned into the 21st century, I've always seen him as, the Field of Dreams part, or the Draft Day, or For the Love of the Game, the sort of sports figure, the coach figure. That's what I've always seen him as. So while his movie star status diminished and his directing career sort of didn't pan out as the way people thought, people almost forget about his movies. And when people think of maybe Kevin Costner, they think of him in a sports movie rather than him in Dances with Wolves. And then I think it's also worth noting that his directing career really didn't pan out in the way maybe he hoped. This was a huge sort of gamble that people thought would totally bomb at the box office, and then didn't, and then became a huge hit. And then he thought he could do it again with The Postman, with another sort of big budgeted movie, but then that movie completely failed. The box office, huge bomb, critically reviled. Then he does Open Range in 2003, and then that's kind of it. He hasn't made a directing movie since. So he has sort of an odd directing career in that sense, this huge sort of big success and then this huge failure, then this one sort of smaller movie near the end. I actually think is maybe his best movie in Open Range. But it's interesting to see that, where Martin Scorsese's next movies were, well beloved and classics, Kevin Costner's next movie, wasn't. And that sort of hurt his directing career, which ultimately I think hurts Dances with Wolves' overall reputation, because now it's only and solely reliant on Kevin Costner as a movie star, whereas I think he's probably best suited as a sort of part character actor, coach kind of a man. So he's still well relevant and still, in movies, and I still know him, and I knew about Dances with Wolves, but it does have a little bit of that English Patient effect where it's maybe a little bit more respected than it is well liked. And if people have the similar opinion to me, where the movie's a little bit too long and doesn't feel necessarily modern in its pacing and things like that, then maybe it could be hard for new viewers to sort of come back and watch the movie. But yeah, like I said, I do understand that it does have its fans, and if anything, it's known for this sort of, I think, really interesting and overlooked at times historical importance in terms of the divergence of the Academy, in terms of the movie star status, in terms of the revival of the Western. It will still be remembered for that, but I think that unfortunately, as a recent sort of continuity of these movies in past episodes, is that I think this movie will be more remembered for being a historical note rather than the movie itself. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts on Dances with Wolves. All that stuff, it's great to see. Do you think Goodfellas should have won? Do you think maybe Ghost should have won? What's your thoughts on Godfather Part 3? Any of that stuff is well appreciated in the comments down below. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.